Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, and friends. Thank you for coming this evening. I want to say hello and welcome everyone here to the Tenement Museum for tonight's program. My name is Michelle Moon. I'm the Chief Program Officer here, and I'm delighted to be here for this night's program and that you've joined us for it. So when you think about New York and New York nostalgia, the Lower East Side, what tends to come to mind is the immigrant Lower East Side, the notion of groups of people, one after another, coming to this neighborhood to make their first settled home in the United States. And often that story, the story that we tell and the story that is told throughout our pop culture and media and our imagination, focuses on that, but oftentimes to the exclusion of other stories, people who've been present here on the Lower East Side since the very beginning. And those stories include the Black and African American residents of the Lower East Side, who you'll learn much more about tonight through our presenters and their conversation. So we're here to explore that topic and to think about how over many centuries that presence has been expressed right here in our own neighborhood. We're interested in doing this at this time because the Tenement Museum has spent the last many years thinking about how we can broaden the stories that we tell. We are a museum of immigration, but also a museum of migration, a museum that looks at the whys and the hows of people moving. What causes people to move? Is it pressured? Is it hopeful? Is it forced? Is it by choice? All of these things can be examined through the lens of residents and living here in the neighborhood. So we are at the beginning of many investigations that are opening that question up for us and for all of our audiences and our neighbors here in the city. And we're excited that you're here for that journey along with us. So tonight you'll be hearing from three panelists: Loren OBrien, who will begin, Carla Peterson, and Brent Leggs, all of whom are here to talk about preservation and placemaking as it's happened here in this area and as it's being pursued across the United States by communities who are looking at histories that have not been as evident and brought to the surface as they should be. So we're excited to hear from them. Each of them will introduce themselves as they come up to the panel. And I ask you to join me in welcoming our first presenter tonight, Loren OBrien. Thank you all.
So hi everyone, as Michelle said, my name is Loren OBrien and I am the lead project scholar or head researcher on the Black Migrations Tour. So let me see, hopefully I can remember how to do this. Oh, okay, so a little snippet about the history of this project. Although the Black Migrations Tour is a new initiative, telling Black stories at the Tenement Museum is not, and doing some archival research into the institutional records, I learned that in the early imaginings of this museum, Ruth Abram always imagined that an African American family would be a part of the family sketches that you now see. And in 1989 to the early 90s, there actually was a family called the Washingtons, which was supposed to be a free Black family from 1850, and that was a family that was a part of regular programming and a story that was told. But for many people, not even just visitors, a lot of staff as well, this kind of history of Black storytelling disappeared or was disremembered, even though it's right here in our archives. And so a lot of this project I want to highlight is that it's not just including and being a new story, but it's really going back to one of the initial plans from the start. Okay. So I want to highlight some of the sites. An important thing about this tour is to get visitors to look at maybe buildings that they may see every day or that they may pass by where Black history is hidden or it's right there in their faces and they just don't know. And so this is 143 Allen Street, which is just around the corner. And this street has multiple connections to enslavement. And so in 1647, here, this land that the house now sits on was granted by the Dutch to a formerly enslaved man named Bastien Negro. And so in the around 1640s, as you can see, a group of enslaved Africans working for the Dutch West India Company petitioned for their freedom. And so they received half freedom, and half freedom meant that they still had to work for the Dutch. Their children were not free, and they had to produce a certain amount of crops and different things like that. But they would be granted land. And so this is a list that was compiled by Ira Berlin and Leslie Harris from Dutch Archives. And so you can see the different names. These people, sometimes the last names tell us where these people were coming from. But Bastien Negro was the individual that got this section that was close to the Bowery and towards Allen Street, where this house now exists. And so this is 1647. Oops. Here is a visual map of this. And so Bastien Negro is right here on 19. And so this community, as you can see, it started to form what is now considered one of New York's first free Black neighborhoods. And it was called the Land of the Blacks. And the Land of the Blacks extended to what is now called Chinatown, Little Italy, this section of the Lower East Side, up to Greenwich Village by NYU. And so it was about 130 acres, which is about the equivalent of 100 city blocks. And so that was what the Land of the Blacks was. So returning to this, so once the Dutch period of New York ended and the British took over New York, a lot of things changed, and that's also where you see an increase in slavery and also more strict rules on the Black inhabitants that were already here. And so during this period, a lot of the individuals that were living in the Land of the Blacks lost their land. And so this particular land that was owned by Bastien changed hands. One of the people who owned it was Delancey, where, you know, Delancey Street's right here. Delancey lost it for treason. And then eventually a man named George Sutton purchased that land and built this row house that's still standing. And so it's important to talk about Sutton is that he also has connections to slavery because he was a cotton merchant. And so he was in charge of a packet line that went from Charleston to New York every Saturday. And he wasn't alone. He also built row houses where these two buildings are for other colleagues that were part of the trade. And so I want to show, this is in a New York City directory. This is Sutton's his role in the packet lines, but you can also see multiple others that are going from New York weekly to other parts of the South. And this is important if you think about the 1619 project that's really kind of emphasizing the North as well as New York's role in slavery, where oftentimes the North kind of portrays himself as innocent or this Underground Railroad, but they are very much complicit and also very much involved. And so men like Sutton gain their wealth off of Black commodification. And so this is an important site because you see how in just a matter of years, or I'll say centuries, how a land can go from being a site of freedom to one of commodification. So another site that's just, around, it's on the same block, which is very interesting, is a subway. And this is 64 and 66 Delancey Street. And 64 and 66 Delancey Street was the downtown core office of the Congress of Racial Equality. And one of the ways that I found this is, sadly, I wasn't looking for this. I knew that there was core activism or activity going on here. And I started doing keyword searches in New York Times historical database. And I just put the Lower East Side. And so a lot of stuff is going to hit. But as you can see in this article, there's no mention of Blacks or African Americans or colored or Negro, and that's might be keywords that people will use to find this history. But if I were to use that, I would have missed this that gave me the address of this office. Unfortunately, once I had that address, I was able to find out that NYU has a whole archive for downtown Corp. And so what I was telling others just earlier is that a lot of this history is here, but sometimes you have to know what you're looking for, which is very unfortunate. You have to have names, you have to have addresses. Some things you can find on your own, but a lot of this rich history, you have to have keys already. A little information about CORE, or the downtown CORE office, is something that's funny since it's a subway, is that one of their main tactics was called sandwich testing. And so what they used to do is, so their major campaign was to fight against discrimination in housing. And so what sandwich testing would do is they would send a white core member or a couple to go visit an apartment to go see if it was available. Then they would send a black couple or a black person to check that same apartment, and then they would send another white couple or a white person to see if the answers would be all the same. It wasn't always the same, and if it wasn't, CORE would then try to file an action against that apartment, or try to be able to create a type of protest to make sure that African Americans as well as Puerto Ricans could get space into these buildings on the Lower East Side. Another important legacy of this is a very famous photo in the civil rights movement, where you learn that 3 core members were kidnapped and later murdered by the Klan. The 2 on the left and the right were from New York City, and actually the one on, I guess this is your left, Michael Schwerner, actually was the co-founder of the downtown core office that is right where the subway is. And so this famous national history and narrative that we hear, where it's often framed in the South where their murder was, they were coming from the North. And so this site is important because I'm sorry, everyone. This site is important because we're connecting the civil rights struggle in the South back to the North and realizing that it's very much connected. Northerners were very much in conversation, and a lot of core activism and civil rights activism happen here and within the Lower East Side as well. So I'm going to conclude on a quote that I found in a letter written by a Black woman to Ruth Abram in the late 80s. And I think it's a good call to action for this tour, as well as more people looking at history in the Lower East Side as well as Lower Manhattan. And so the descendant Gina Manuel wrote to Ruth Abram, "When you are planning the museum, I beg of you, please, please don't forget them as Black people. Their spirits walk those halls and their bones lay in the earth there, and we remember them." And so when I read this, I was very moved by this, and I think it's an important call to action, and again, reminding you that Black history was always supposed to be about the Lower East Side and then be featured in the Tenement Museum. So this tour should be just the first step in kind of reclaiming that past history and kind of fulfilling this promise that was made decades ago. And so thank you all. Okay, so I'll have the next 2 panelists introduce themselves.
My name is Carla Peterson. I was a professor. I'm now emerita at the University of Maryland in the English department. I am a literary critic, first and foremost, but I have been gradually moving towards doing cultural history, social history, and so forth. And I wrote a book that was published in 2011 that was a family history. So the title is Black Gotham, A Family History of African Americans in 19th Century New York City. And I think that's why I'm here. So do you want me to go and do my thing?
Yeah.
Okay, and I have, 7 minutes? 7 minutes, all right, I better start. So I took notes so that I would adhere to them. So what the question that I was asked to answer is, or how do we tell specific stories about Black people? Carla shares her experience in uncovering family histories of Black New York. So I could be at this all night long telling you the story of my family, and I can't do it because I only have 7 minutes. So I decided to answer the question or gesture towards the question of why and how. And the what will be for Q&A if you want to know anything about my family. So the why, of course, is personal. At a certain point, not when we're young, but probably when we get somewhat older, we get really curious about our families, right? And one of the things that I think is really, is so obvious, but that I think is really important is that we all have families. Every single person in this room has a family, and therefore, family history is inherently interesting to everybody, whether you're, Black American, Irish, Jewish, or whatever. Family is actually a tie that binds us all together. When you think about the 19th century, though, in 19th century Black Americans, one of the common things that was said in the 19th century was that Black Americans don't know anything about families, right? And if you think of the slave experience in the South, it's, well, we can easily separate mothers and fathers and children and husbands and wives because they really don't care. They don't know anything about the ties that bind, that nurture. And that was, a common thought for a really long time, and of course is absolutely ridiculous. So it seemed to me that it was also really important to stress the idea of family in the 19th century. And my family happened to be an intact family, mother, father, and kids, but they're families in all configurations. And I think that that's important to realize as well, that it can be kin, extended family, non-kin, but to think about family, and especially for Blacks in the 19th century, I think is really important. The other thing that I think that conclusion I came to as I was working on my book was the importance of family history, or how family history really allows us to talk about something that you had talked about, issues of remembering and forgetting. What is it that we choose to remember of the past? What do we choose to forget? And if you remember at the end of Toni Morrison's Beloved, that famous line, this is not a story to pass on. So why do we choose to pass on stories or not to pass them on? So this then brings us to histories of trauma and shame, and the way in which I think that exploring one's family history really helps to confront, well, what exactly was that trauma, why the shame, and what can we do about it? So I think of family history as recovery work in many different senses, the facts, but also the emotions that lie behind it. So the how. I decided to write this book about my great-grandfather, and it turned out to be about my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather. I didn't know anything about my great-grandfather. And of course, what one hopes for and expects is that there are stories in the family that have been passed down from generation to generation. So raise your hand if you've had stories passed down through your family, if your grandparents, your greats, your great-greats. Lucky you. Who has not had any family stories passed on? Yeah, okay. So here I was confronted with knowing very, very little about my family. And so what was I going to do? People, my friends, my colleagues were saying, you need to write this story about your family. We know, that they were important Black New Yorkers, part of the educated elite class, and in the 19th century, tell this story. So what I had to do was turn to the archives. And one of the things that I found out that very quickly that somehow surprised me was that there was a real will on the part of 19th century Black New Yorkers to remember. They wanted stories to pass on. And they did it in forms of newspapers and publishing newspapers and then trying to collect them in books and making them a library item. In terms of commemorative ceremonies, January 1, 1808, 1809, 1810, to commemorate the end of the slave trade, wanting to build statues, erect statues to famous Black New Yorkers or others. Burial grounds, the African burial ground, that is a place of remembering, right? So there were all these efforts, but very often they were not successful. There was a lack of resources, or what had been created and preserved very quickly got lost. So I'll give you one example. A very well-known Black New Yorker by the name of James McCune Smith, who was a doctor, a Black activist, and so forth, was talking about the proceedings of the national conventions that were held every year. And he talked about their loss destroyed by the draft riots. But he said that was our Alexandrine library. And out of which the noblest pages of our history could have been written. So to think that of what was amassed in the 19th century in terms of texts that could have been an Alexandrine library for us, that got lost. But you have to start with the premise that documentation is there, that not everything has been lost. And a lot of people said to me, "Oh, you're so lucky. There were papers, you found stuff in the archives." So I said, "Well, did you try?" And they're like, "Well, no." And I'm like, "Well, go and try." And you never know what you'll find in the archives. So you could start with traditional sources. Those would be city directors. Once again, you need to have a name. City directories, census, genealogical records, birth, marriage dates, if you have a name, and so forth. But these don't tell stories, and I think that that's what the Tenement Museum is getting at, is the desire to tell stories. We just don't want genealogy and facts, but what kind of stories can you tell? And there I found newspapers very helpful. I found that very often, if you went to look for records of Black institutions, as James McCune Smith said, our Alexandrine library has disappeared, has been destroyed, but white institutions were able to preserve their documents to a much greater extent. And sometimes when you go through white documents, you will find some record about Blacks who were there. I'm thinking of the Colored Orphan Asylum led by white women, but Blacks were there, and they're not written in the center of the page, but they're on the margins, and you can find them. Manuscript material is also, you come across a manuscript and all of a sudden there's something there. And then, of course, the importance of place, going to the African burial ground and thinking of that again as a kind of archive. In typing up these notes, I came across 3 S's, and I'll just mention them really quickly. The first one is serendipity, is that when you're going through the archives, you never know what you find, and sometimes your find is totally serendipitous. So I was going through the Harry Albro Williamson papers at the Schomburg and not finding anything about my family, but there was this really interesting story about Grandma Marshall, and how she worked as a domestic for a white family, but she would always take the weekend off, and she'd go shop at Lord & Taylor, which opened in 1835, and she'd get lace, and it was just fascinating. So I took all these notes, and a few years later, I discovered she was my great-great-great-grandmother. So there, and I had no idea when I was taking those notes. So that's serendipity. The other thing I talk about a lot in my book is the idea of the scrap. So you're not going to find, I remember when I was trying to find a publisher for the book, like, well, where are the diaries? Where are the letters? Where's the whatever? I'm like, no, but they're scraps. And I kept on finding references to scraps. People writing in the period saying, well, I have a scrapbook. I have a scrap of this or that or the other. Scraps are really important because if you put them together, you can perhaps tell a story. My last S is speculation. that very often you're never going to be sure of something. So what is your alternative? Well, I'm not sure. I think this. Am I going to stay silent, or am I going to put it out there as a speculation? So I'm not a historian, I'm a literary critic, and I gather that historians don't like speculation. But I was like, I'm not a historian, so I'm going to speculate. And, so I guess what I'm saying is that it's an act of imagination. It's history, but it's also imagination, and the freedom to speculate. And very often, it turns out that you're quite right. The last thing, two more things. That the archives are always dynamic. When you go and you find something, it's never the end. So since my book has been published, people have been writing me. Oh, did you know that your great-great-grandmother's sister actually went to Prudence Crandall's school in Connecticut? Well, no, I didn't know that. So that was a wonderful piece of information. And on and on and on. So think of the archives as dynamic. You're never done. At a point, you have to stop and publish your book, but you're actually never done. So this is, I guess, maybe my what, and it's going to be really short. I told this story about my family, but also in telling the story of my family, I told this story, of course, about a much larger group, a much larger history. And I talk at the beginning of my book, in my introduction, about concentric circles. So I start with the family, and then I start with what Alex Crummell called, I think, the larger social circle of elite families or something like that. So the people that they would have hung out with. And from there, so that's the next circle. And from there, I went to the community, to the kind of institutions, churches, benevolent societies, schools that people would have gone to. And from there, I went to the city. And that was, to me, so interesting to realize that Blacks lived not, I was talking to somebody earlier about, we think of Harlem as a model that brought together community and neighborhood. But actually, community, if you think of it in terms of institutions, were spread out all over in the early 19th century, as were neighborhoods. And so Lower East Side was one, but the West Side, what's now Tribeca, Soho, were also neighborhoods where Blacks were. And so the idea that they are always crossing paths with white people, workers as well as white elites. So I think the section of that book I call Distance and Proximity. So they're distant in terms of social class and their ability to interact with one another, maybe, not always. But the proximity, the geographic proximity was really there. You can then extend out to other cities, and I'm currently working on a project that brings in Philadelphia and the ties between New York and Philadelphia. Blacks in New York and Philadelphia were very, very intense, shared assumptions about what it meant to be Black and so forth, families intermarrying and so forth. And my last circle was the cosmos, because the people that I talk about in my book were cosmopolitan. First of all, they came from all over the world, from Africa, from India, from Morocco, from England, from the Netherlands, from Venezuela. They came from all over the world. So they were cosmopolitan from the get-go, but they were also so interested in acquiring all kinds of knowledge also from around the world. And they were not limited either to city or to nation, but really thought of themselves as citizens of the world.
Good evening, everyone. I'm honored to share this panel with these legends. Really, legends. So my name is Brent Leggs. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I work for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I consider myself an activist, a preservation practitioner, and a cultural entrepreneur. and I will share what I mean by that. I have the good fortune of leading a new initiative at the National Trust called the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. It's a $25 million campaign to tell the full history of America, but to rewrite the traditional narrative. And what I mean by that, I'm passionate about using historic places and stories to reconstruct our national identity through the lens of Black activism, achievement, community, architecture, entrepreneurship, and so much more. That's the power and the potential of this Black migration story that the Tenement Museum is embarking upon. And some of my work and some of the projects that I've had the good fortune of supporting includes a place in Irvington, New York. Anybody heard of a remarkable woman called Madam C.J. Walker? America's first self-made female millionaire. Most folks don't realize that she has a migration story. In 1918, she had the gall, after she had amassed her wealth, that she would integrate the most expensive zip code in the United States, that she would build a 20,000 square foot mansion, Italianate design, on the same street as Jay Gould's Lyndhurst, arguably the most significant Gothic architecture in the United States, 3 miles from the Rockefeller estate, Kikett. In 1917, the New York Times Magazine says that when she was on the grounds inspecting the progress of the construction, that the neighbors thought she was the maid, just to find out she was their neighbor. Madam Walker is a legend, and there's a Black migration story embedded within her legacy. So, what about Birmingham? Has anyone been to the Civil Rights District in Birmingham, Alabama? It's a pretty cool place, right? So we were working on a vacant building called the A.G. Gaston Motel, arguably one of the most significant landmarks in all of civil rights. It's where the Birmingham campaign, Project C, was developed and implemented in the War Room in Room 30. Dr. King, Reverend Shuttlesworth, Reverend Abernathy, and the foot soldiers changed our nation and the world through their political activism. When we got involved in that space, I thought, Birmingham had this untold legacy that needed to be institutionalized within our national parks, and that was our aim. But as we started to pull back and discover the rich, multi-layered history, I learned that A.G. Gaston, with a 10th grade education, would become the most successful Black entrepreneur during the period of segregation in all of Alabama. That in 1954, he would build the first Black motel in that state as a space of luxury for Black travelers. I also would learn that within the Civil Rights District, standing in this urban landscape where Blacks migrated from the agricultural South and the Black Belt to the heart of Birmingham, stands a Masonic temple designed by architect Robert Taylor. He's America's first academically trained Black architect and first graduate of MIT. Down the street is 16th Street Baptist Church. We know of the events that happened there in September of 1963. Most Americans don't realize that that building was designed by the second academically trained Black architect, Wallace Rayfield, let alone the 2 mid-century modern buildings constructed and designed by A.G. Gaston. Birmingham is an unmatched cultural landscape that tells a story of Black entrepreneurship, activism, community achievement, and so much more, but also Black migration. Has anyone heard of a boxer named Joe Frazier? So Joe Frazier is from South Carolina. And like the story that you talked about, the Black experience is often rooted in racism. 1619 Project has brought to light the origin story of America. It really isn't 1776, it really is 1619. And it's rooted in a painful past. And that legacy was threatening to Joe Frazier. And so he fled, literally to save his life, landed in Philadelphia, on North Broad Street in Philadelphia. He would acquire and own for 4 decades Joe Frazier's gym. When we were writing the National Register nomination and local nomination to protect that space in perpetuity, we wanted to ensure that that migration story was embedded within the narrative, right? He didn't just become something, his life experiences created who he is. Anybody heard of John and Alice Coltrane? So we all know John. And in their house in the 1960s, they left New York and they would integrate a suburb called Dix Hills on Long Island. Inside this ranch-style house, John would compose after spending a week in their second bedroom upstairs, A Love Supreme. After he passed away, Alice would record her first 5 studio albums in their basement recording studio. This is a rich and beautiful space that highlights Black romance and love, arts and culture, and all of the elements that makes life and families work and exist. The building is currently vacant, and we are working with a coalition of partners, including the Friends of the John and Alice Coltrane home, to ensure that that place has a bright future. And I just want to close. In the work of the Action Fund, we're looking to support the preservation of 150 Black history sites. This really is a transformational moment in the U.S. preservation movement. We know that most places preserved tells the story of white industrialists, wealthy farmers, presidents. But it's time that we begin to tell the full American history. And the success of the Action Fund lays the blueprint and foundation for the Latino American preservation movement, for the LGBTQ movement, for women's history, for Asian American history, so that over the next decades, that all Americans begin to see themselves and their history and their potential in the historic places like the Tenement Museum that surround us all. And last, I had the good fortune of being the senior advisor for the interpretation at James Madison's Montpelier. Anybody heard of James Madison? Considered the father of the Constitution. This is a National Trust historic site. For years, we have told his story and the story of Dolly Madison. But we did not tell the story of the enslaved workers there. So like over the next 2 days, where scholars and practitioners are coming together to reimagine history at a site, we did the same thing. And the result was a permanent exhibit called The Mere Distinction of Color. If you have not toured it, please do so. It tells a story of Black resistance on that landscape of enslavement. It leverages art and film making to tell a story of Black female resistance on that site. And what's most beautiful is that it brings the past into the present by highlighting the modern and contemporary legacies of slavery, like police brutality and all the things that we stand against today. We are at a transformational moment. I applaud the Tenement Museum and your research for following through on the promise that Ruth and others saw decades ago, which is to tell the multi-layered history. And I hope that you go beyond this neighborhood and that you begin to connect and uplift and promote the public spaces that interprets history, like Weeksville Heritage Center, a free black settlement, Louis Armstrong House Museum in Queens, Langston Hughes House in Harlem. There are public spaces that needs to be connected to the work that happens here, and given that these visitors are coming to learn about New York history and American history, send them on their own migration across New York so they begin to discover and walk in the footsteps of our past. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla and Brent. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up. Some of you, or both of you, already kind of touched on many of these. But the first, what do you think are the challenges or barriers to getting these stories amplified?
So should I keep this real? I want to say to all the white people in the room, it's okay to preserve your whiteness and your identity. Like, has anyone ever said that it's okay to celebrate who you are? In that celebration, it means that our nation has overlooked diverse history. We have underfunded the stories and the historic places related to the black experience in America. We have undervalued these places. The majority of places that we have worked to preserve, literally, A.G. Gaston Motel is a centerpiece of the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument that President Obama signed in the last week before he left office. The building is still vacant. I could give you a list of 25 nationally significant Black, Latino, Asian American sites that are vacant and are waiting for our love, care, and attention. We're about to embark on 2020. Look at all the women in this room. Look at all the women that have led the fight to preserve American history, whether it's Joan Maynard, whether it's Ruth, whether it's the women in this room or the panelists on right here. We have to begin to honor the full contributions of all Americans. And so I think the challenge is that we have to build our cultural competency to be able to value people that are different from ourselves.
So I'll add just a little bit to that, and more specific about New York, which is what I know. So it seemed, I was talking to somebody earlier, we got to the problem of Harlem. And I'm also a 19th century person. So the way in which I think Harlem is so dominated and the history of Black New York and overshadowed other aspects of our history. So I think that that presents a problem of people wanting immediately to jump to Harlem and to forget about everything that came before, and not wanting to see and to try and work at a continuous history. I think also that for the 19th century, and this is more largely, that the history of slavery has also still dominated the landscape. And so there's much less interest or attention that's been paid to so-called free Blacks in the North, which is kind of puzzling because everybody knows about Du Bois, right? And James Weldon Johnson, and we celebrate them as these magnificent intellectuals, but people don't, they're like, I was saying earlier, they're like disembodied heads. And people don't want to situate them in certain places, which are, I mean, all kinds of different places, Great Barrington, Massachusetts, Jacksonville, Florida, but also very importantly, New York City. And they are, end of 19th century people. You all know about Skip Gates and his migration or his, not migration, what is it? The what?
Yes, his TV show.
His TV show, yeah. So I got called several years ago. Oh, we hear that you have a history, et cetera, et cetera. We're thinking about having you participate in the show. Da, da, da. So I started out talking about my family as free Black New Yorkers going back to the 1770s or something, and they practically just hung up on me because I was not telling the South to North migration story. And I'm like, don't you want a ritual tapestry of Black life? And no, they wanted the South to North migration story. And then I'll say a couple of things about my experience of working with a cultural institution. I mean, I'm not like Brent at all. And I'll name them because they ended up doing an absolutely wonderful job. This is the Museum of the City of New York. Have you, any of you seen the New York at its core? It's fabulous, right? And yet I was there to do 19th century Black New York, and it was somewhat of a struggle. So I'm talking about people who had really, really good intentions, who wanted to tell the story, but had a hard time grappling with it. And you sent out a paper in my Stuff for Tomorrow about, what is it, your themes, your core ethical themes? No, what is it called? Values, your core values. And two of them caught my eye out of the six, and one was complexity and one was agency. And what I realized was that the staff at the museum had a hard time grappling with the complexity of Black New York history in the 19th century. They wanted to talk about the presence of slavery and then the aftermath of slavery, but really didn't want to consider, other kinds of the complexity of free life in the so-called free Blacks in the North and what that might have been like, et cetera. And along with that became the problem of agency, and which is another one of your values. So to me, that there was a real lack of agency and creating a population that was both complex and filled with agency, whether in building community institutions, churches, education, whatever. And so I had to press them on it, but that was my job, right? And I think they ended up doing a really, really good job. So this is to point out that even when you're there, when you've got people there and willing, that you still have to work at it.
Yeah. And Carla, you kind of did a great transition and almost answered a little bit this next question. But what are ways that community and grassroots efforts to preserve cultural memories are intersecting with the work that cultural institutions are doing? Or are they even intersecting?
So again, you're the cultural institution person, but I'll take a stab at some of my my recent experiences. So I think that what's really interesting and important is that the goals are the same. Community, institution, grassroots have the same goals as cultural institutions. Of course, I'm talking about places like the Museum, the City of New York, and the New York Historical Society, people who are already invested in telling the story. And so I think a lot of the goals are very much the same, so that there should be and can be a very rich intersection between the two. And I don't know whether I'm getting too specific for what you're thinking of, but one example I can give is I helped the New York Historical Society work on its citizenship in the era of Jim Crow. Did anybody see that? Black citizenship in the era of Jim Crow. And they ended up, as I remember, the last section was with St. Philip's Episcopal Church. And that was my family's church. And so they came to me, or they asked me, and I suggested it. And so that was the way they contacted people at St. Philip's, and St. Philip's got very involved in that exhibit. So I think that that's one great example of the way in which the work can intersect in very fruitful ways.
So I'll share a little story. When I was in grad school at the University of Kentucky, I was asked, she said, whoa. I'm from Paducah, Kentucky. I claim that landscape. And I was asked to conduct a statewide inventory of historic Rosenwald schools in my home state. Anybody not heard of Rosenwald Schools? Booker T. Washington in 1912 envisioned this massive school building program to provide architecturally innovative school buildings for black kids all across the South. He partnered with Julius Rosenwald, who at the time was the second president of Sears and Roebuck, kind of the Bill Gates of the day. And together they helped to fund the construction of over 5,000 schools in 15 southern states. And during that process, I learned my mom and dad went to Rosenwald Schools. And that has put me on this trajectory to preserve culturally important places. But in that year and a half research project, I met so many well-intentioned, altruistic individuals trying to preserve a building held up by a tree, literally doing all they could to save the physical evidence of our past. And I knew that there was a gap in the marketplace and an opportunity for cultural institutions to redirect investment resources to uplift and build the capacity of grassroots. I also started doing some research, and I discovered that the Black National Preservation Movement literally was birthed through the effort of the National Association of Colored Women, when in 1917 they launched a national campaign, completed it in 1922. They paid off the mortgage of the home of Frederick Douglass. Literally, they burned the deed and birthed this national movement. Just citizens coming together, organizing themselves from ad hoc to a more formal organization, and today that site is part of our national parks. We have been investing in building the capacity through our preservation leadership trainings, and literally just being a friend and mentor to people that need to be supported. So I will say to you that if you're leading a cultural institution, today, cultural institutions and social justice is the relevancy of these spaces. And it's our social responsibility to uplift others that's part of our broader movement. And then I also will say to you, if you are part of a grassroots preservation project, know that there are folks like us at the National Trust. There are statewide organizations like the South Carolina African American Heritage Commission in North Carolina, Kentucky, and many other places that exist to be able to help you achieve your dream.
Thank you both.
So there's, the documentary on the Rosenwalds, the Aviva Kemper.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic documentary.
Yeah, so, for those of you who don't know, you want to say it's a fabulous documentary.
Yeah, so Aviva Kempner, who is a big fan and wants to really elevate Julius Rosenwald's life and contributions, created a documentary 2 years ago on the Julius Rosenwald Fund. A piece of that is the Rosenwald Schools. He literally funded fellowships and scholarships. All of the acclaimed black artists and intellectuals of that day benefited from the Rosenwald Fund. It's a remarkable documentary.
So look out for it. It's really very good.
So my last question is, you both shared that this work of preservation and heritage is not new, but there does seem to be a renewed interest on behalf of cultural institutions and other organizations to be engaged in this work. And so what do you think is different about this particular time for preservation and heritage work versus in the past?
So I'll say there are two influential moments. Charleston and Charlottesville. That's where we saw culture, heritage, and public spaces collide in the most negative and violent ways. It also put cultural heritage and historic preservation at the forefront of a national conversation about American identity and history. That was a transformational moment. Then also having black professionals and professionals of color that are academically trained, that are now in leadership positions within cultural institutions to be able to leverage those kinds of moments and redirect the mission of organizations. That will continue to be key for this movement to grow and to be inclusive.
Yeah, I would just add, it seems to me that more than before, there's a real interest, not just in Black history, but across the board in telling history through the lives of ordinary people, or let's say, not something other than the great men stories. So, it used to be all about the presidents, and I think that there's been a real interest, and I'm not sure I can explain why, well, because we've become a lot more aware of our diversity, of our inclusivity, but just a real interest in telling history through the lives of not great white men. The other thing, and I was thinking about this, is I think maybe technology has had a really profound impact on our ability to tell stories. And so things that before you had to go to a museum or you had to go to read a book, but now with digitization, the stuff that is there is just so amazing. Websites, blogs, apps, what else? It's just that I think there's a lot of bad about the internet, but there's a lot of good. And the way in which this information really gets disseminated, and there's some just gorgeous work out there. You just turn on your computer and there's some really, really wonderful stuff. You could spend hours just exploring history right there and then go out. So it seems to me that also is difference in our time.
So now we're going to open it up. Yeah.
I have a question and then a comment. I'd like to address the first presentation. It was notable, the first list that you showed, that it was not only in 1619, but obviously 1647. We see that most of the Africans most likely came from the port of Luanda in present-day Angola. And the land of the blacks was also referred to in New York as Little Angola. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, you jumped from 1647 to the 19th century. So I'm wondering if there's ongoing work on those 200 years. That's the first question. And then the comment is, you put a picture of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner up, and you said that they were core workers. Well, that's not exactly true. Schwerner certainly was in Lower East Side. But as a former field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, I have to remind you that the Freedom Summer that we organized in 1964 was a SNCC project. And the reason that we did it was because black people in Mississippi were being killed all the time, and no one cared. So we decided, and it was a very conscious decision, to bring down the sons and daughters of powerful whites in the society, because we knew that would attract the press. So, and James Cheney was not a member of CORE, he was a member of SNCC. And it was SNCC that organized. Yes, Schwerner I was a member of SNCC in New Haven from 1959 until 1962. But it was SNCC that was responsible for that. And SNCC was responsible for so much of what happened in Mississippi, which now culminated in having both a father and son black mayors of Jackson.
Well, first, thank you for sharing about your personal insight. I think this is why it's also important for oral histories and folks that have been involved to be able to share their experiences so there can be clarification. So first, I'll say thank you for that. For the 200-year span, I mean, there have been histories that have been written. So there's books by Leslie Harris, and then there's also a Black Gotham tour. And they really hone in on slavery and that period, I would say those 200 years. So there are other projects and initiatives that are addressing that, because we are kind of doing a task that is going to be difficult of talking about multiple different centuries, where some other projects might just focus on the 19th century, or just more focused time periods, and we're jumping around. We happen to kind of do that jump. But I think you highlight an important issue where we do need to explain why there is a jump and where people can find resources to get more information and context about that. Another thing that you mentioned about the names and a lot of the enslaved Africans being from Angola is, it is important to highlight that heritage, and they are referred to as Atlantic Creoles, not just Africans, because they brought with them to New York a vast range and knowledge from the Atlantic world. And so these, like most enslaved people, they had trades and they had skills, and that's why they were brought to different parts of the United States to work. And a lot of those Atlantic Creoles were skilled in linguistics and different type of trades that were profitable for the Dutch West India Company. So it's important in that in doing the names that we explain that history as well. So thank you very much.
I just want to say thank you for using your life to confront racism and injustice. Thank you for sharing that story.
Hi, thank you so much. Mark Twain, H.L. Mencken, and others wrote about this country's history of willful ignorance. And so we're faced, of course, again with a case of, on a national level, where facts don't matter. Yes, we're whittling away at that, as you said, through the internet, apps, and everything else. But sometimes it just seems like there's a tidal wave, and we also have this notion that progress is some slow, straight line going up, when that's not necessarily true. So how do we be resilient or keep going or look at other, because things don't have to keep going in one direction?
I think resilience lives in Black DNA, and all we have to do is get up.
So I remember a friend of mine saying years ago, he had one word: struggle. And it's an ongoing struggle. And yeah, there's never an end, but it's just a repeated struggle, which is kind of the same as resilience.
May I jump in real quick? Because one of the things you mentioned, I used to give, thank you, you give lectures and bring up James Weldon Johnson. And that song says what? The famous line is like, when that day will come. Is that day ever coming? And so if that day is not coming, then we need to change our perspective. I'm not going to struggle my whole life. We're going to win. And so there's a difference between struggle and conquest. Napoleon didn't struggle. Alexander didn't struggle. They had to go for the win. And I think one of the things that we talk about is that what's the other, I won't take up too much mic time, but the gentleman's got a book out now talking about how we interpret our struggle when there are other goals and things that sometimes are holding us back that we don't even see.
That's actually one of the challenges with building momentum around the preservation of American history, is that it's not a big priority. And we as a movement, as institutions, haven't articulated the real value of preservation, that it benefits our well-being, our psychological, emotional health, the economic benefits of preservation. I could go on and on and on. But I would ask you to look at Fort Monroe. 20 Africans arrived. Look at Birmingham. Those 20 Africans self-emancipated, became contraband of war. They inspired 500,000 freedom seekers in their footsteps in 1861, and it's an unknown catalyst to emancipation. if we literally marked all the times that we innovated and advanced the system and idea of justice, even to the civil rights movement in the 20th century and to the activism that happens today, we are moving towards a more just nation, and you measure that through the historic places we preserve.
Just a short comment on what you just said. When I was 18 years old in Mississippi, and I'm not from Mississippi, I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. I was asking the very same question. So we're struggling? I mean, like, is there ever going to be an end? There was a song that we used to sing. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. Get on board, boy, get on board.
I actually have a more practical question for Carla. You mentioned the archives in sort of a general way, but I'm curious with the names you were armed with. Did you start with your university's archives? Did you start with a census record? Like, which archives did you decide to dig in first? And maybe where did they lead you?
So I had one name, Philip Augustus White, who's my great-grandfather. Having White as a family name was not helpful, just like not helpful. And I had a story about him that turned out to be false. I was told that he was half true, that he was a white Haitian who, at the time of the Haitian Revolution, went to Paris. So he was born Philippe Auguste Blanc, went to Paris, became a pharmacist, then emigrated to the United States, to New York, anglicized his name to Philip Augustus White, and became a pharmacist. So the only true part of that story was that his name was Philip Augustus White, and that he came from, and that he was from New York. The rest was just not. So, I got virtually nothing from my family, but what I got was somewhat a tad romanticized. And so I'm not a historian, as I said, and I really, really didn't know what to do. And my very dear friend, Ira Berlin, who passed away earlier this year, took me under his wing. I was his oldest graduate student, I used to say, and told me to come up to New York and to start with this census. And I couldn't. I'm a literary critic. So I just couldn't do it. I didn't know what to say. I just didn't know how to do it. So the archives that I used here were the Schomburg, primarily, the New York Historical Society, the New York Public Library. I also ended up going to Jersey City and doing some work there. For different reasons I won't go into. I went to the botanical gardens, et cetera, wherever things took me. And I was really, really lucky because I started out with a manuscript. Because I'm a literary critic, so I was like, I need to read some words. So I went and I got this, the diary of Maritza Lyons that's at the Schomburg. And I was reading through it, and that's where I found the reference to Grandma Marshall, who turned out to be my great-great-grandma, great-great-great-grandma, which I didn't know. But she also had a segment on my great-grandfather, Philip Augustus White. So I knew he was for real, and I knew material, The other big find I had was also at the Schomburg, a woman by the name of Rhoda Freeman, I think, had written a Columbia dissertation in the 1970s. She died, and I think her husband had gotten the book published and then left her archives with the Schomburg. And they were you're too young. The shoe boxes, right, with the note cards, and she had, I think, 11 or 12 of those. And number 8 was biography. So I decided to go through biography, and I found a page devoted to my great grandfather, to Philip Augustus White. So it was a fascinating page, and I won't go into it. That in itself was a commemoration because it had all kinds of things other than his obit, but I won't go into it. I don't want to hog everybody's time. But right behind, so I was like, well, I might as well keep on going. And right behind it was this page, folded up, devoted to a man named Peter Guignon. And I'm like, well, let me go and look. And right there, the middle column was like, he married, Philip Augustus White married his daughter, Peter Guignon's daughter. So I knew immediately that that was my great-great-grandfather. So that really started me. Then I had another name, and the obituaries are fabulous. I mean, they're just amazing. Both obituaries gave me so much to work with. I was able to trace Philip Augustus White, through his schooling at one of the African free schools, his participation in St. Philip's Episcopal Church, his becoming a pharmacist. He actually got a diploma from the College of Pharmacy of the City of New York in 1844. I went out to Wisconsin where the pharmacy records are, and I verified all of that. I mean, I saw the document, And then also Peter Guignon, who went to school a generation or half a generation before Philip Augustus White, with all the young men who became really famous leaders in black leaders in New York. So James McCune Smith, Henry Highland Garnett, Alexander Crummell, George Downing, Charles Reason, they were all there at the same school. So that really, it was the Schomburg that gave me the material to work with.
Hello. Did any of you three research or touch on St. Augustine's Episcopal Church on Henry Street, namely because they have a slave gallery upstairs?
Yes. So the Tenement Museum actually has a relationship with them, and they helped Deacon Hopper, who was one of the main primary leaders, to get the slave galleries acknowledged and to start that project. He helped fund or create like a historical commission, and it's important in the way that I envisioned, or I'm proposing that we include that story, is that Deacon Hopper, as well as the other congregants of St. Augustine, are using heritage to stake a claim to the Lower East Side and to mark that they deserve to be here. Where the Lower East Side, if you haven't noticed, it's rapidly gentrifying and it's rapidly changing. And as I mentioned before, where although Black folks have been here for centuries, their place is now kind of not being seen as here. And that's one of the oldest churches, and they really took a time where there was a movement to make the Lower East Side a historical district, and it didn't include their section. And so that was a real call of action to use heritage and to make sure that this legacy of the slave galleries, as well as this community has been here, and they are a part of the Lower East Side history, and that needs to be acknowledged. And Brent actually shared that he helped do some work with St. Augustine. He could share with that.
So when I was reading the materials that you prepared, and I saw St. Augustine Slave Galleries, and I saw the name Deacon Hopper. So I had a regional African American program when I was working out of Boston, and we were supporting 74 organizations, cultural institutions interpreting Black history. And one was St. Augustine's. And when I met Deacon Hopper, and when I toured that space, I don't know if you've had a chance to tour the galleries, but at that point, they needed funding to restore them. So we invested $30,000 to do that. But walking up that narrow and crooked stairwell, literally you begin to have a multi-sensory experience with that place, and it brought to life what it meant to be enslaved or a free person of color, but you are excluded in a place of religion. It really tells a story. For me, what was most compelling is it told the story of slavery in the North. And that is confronting this contradiction that it only happened in the South.
So I actually have a question about this. I went to the galleries years ago with Ira Berlin. That was his first stab at trying to turn me into a historian. He said, we're going to go up to New York. They're asking questions about this, the church, and about the slave gallery, and they want to know whether it really is a slave gallery or not. So I went up with Ira, and I just was quiet as a mouse because I didn't know anything about history. And we went up, and he and the person who was taking us around engaged in this debate about whether it was a slave gallery or not. And if I remember correctly, the date they gave was 1829, and slavery ended in 1827. So they went back and forth, well, okay, it's nominally, it officially ended in 1827, but there still could be slaves, whatever. They discussed that maybe it was a storage space, and then they talked about the way that it had been, there'd been a gap of several decades before there was any mention of it as a slave gallery. And so a question of whether there was myth making involved and whether it had become a myth. So that's where I left off. So I would love for you to either of you to fill in the gaps, if what I remembered was correct. Oh, you've got that, sorry.
Yeah, it's funny that you say, it's still kind of this debate about what happened. So you're very much up to date in this.
Speculation.
But in one example that I see kind of the similar question happening is the door of no returns, if people are familiar with that, in Senegal, where there's a similar debate where historians have proved that technically no enslaved people went through those doors. But if you look at narratives or if you talk to people who visit there's a sensory experience happening while visiting this site. And UNESCO, it's still a national or international site, and they bring up the question of memory and how it could be a symbolic, it still has a presence and a connection to slavery. There are still enslaved people connected to that site. But what does it mean if the narrative that is moving all these people and these people who are going and feel that they are being influenced by the ghost of this space is the facts or the truth? Is, does that mean something? Like, it goes back to your speculation, where is that the true power, or to disrupt what's happening at this site where people are connecting to it? Or do we need to be more, I guess, what's the word? I can't think of the word, but truth. Yeah, what's the truth? And so they're still grappling with that, and they have a new deacon who's beginning to think about how they want to move forward, because that space is now, they have like a lot of different artists that come and to activate that space. And it's like, well, what is the narrative that we want to tell now with this story? And what does it mean where if we use this history to help kind of make our space here, and we're proud of this history now, what does it mean what are these questions, and how does that now become a part of the narrative that we're telling?
Yeah, so I really see this as a story of spatial segregation and disenfranchisement. I always understood the 1829 slave gallery and trusting the word of a deacon. But we must tell the truth at historic sites, and unlike a writer that has some flexibility, there to imagine, as you said. And that's important because that's how you draw people in through stories and books. But visitors trust the interpretation and education that they receive at a historic site more than anything else. There are two scholars that have studied this. It's grounded in reality. So we have to ensure that they are learning the truth. And what we see often at historic sites is that the interpretation evolves as the documentation grounds that interpretation. But I'm glad you brought that up, because you need to define exactly what that is.
I hope Ira heard all of that.
Thank you all for being here. It's something that's come up a bit as you've discussed different endeavors and in your writings and researching and landmarking, but thinking about those good intentions and people who mean well, what are some of the pitfalls you've observed or experienced when you're thinking specifically about Black placemaking and community, especially within an institution that historically has not done that consistently? I mean, when you're dealing with outside expectations and huge spans of time, I'm just wondering, can you speak sort of specifically to any of that you've come across?
I think there's a lot of, I mentioned earlier, lack of cultural competency. There are a lot of well-intentioned members of our communities that will go in and use the kind of trendy language that we're going to create a placemaking strategy, often through the arts in historic Black neighborhoods, when there's already a place with an existing identity, with a heritage that is rich and a community that is prideful of that space. So it's about the approach in many ways, going in humble, not going in just because you're part of an institution or you're academically trained and you're directing strategy, but you are collaborating and being inclusive and understanding what that community's vision is for itself, and then bringing the resources to help them achieve it.
So I haven't really worked with community institutions, just when museums have asked me, for my input. So I gave the example before of the very well-intentioned Museum of the City of New York, and how it really, there was so much that they wanted to tell. I mean, they had two small rooms and wanted to tell the history of all New York from the beginning to actually into the future. That's the third. The third room was the future, and so I understood the limitations, but so they were like, do we really have to? It's like, can't we just talk about how slavery ended so late in New York City? And so you really had to press them. If you're going to tell the story, tell it properly in its complexity. And the thing that really upset me the most was the lack of agency. To the extent that they discussed Black New Yorkers in the 19th century, they were agentless people, and that really, really bothered me. Years and years ago, I was a consultant for a museum, the Cincinnati Museum. Underground Railroad? Yeah. Is it still there? It is. Is it doing well? It's oh. Yes. Oh, then I won't. Then I won't say anything more. Except that Richard Rabinowitz was leading, from the American History Workshop, was leading that, and it was really a case of, the white elite of Cincinnati wanting to do good, and isn't it between two stadiums, the Hoosies and the what is it, Bengals, and the what's the other?
Baseball?
Yeah. The Reds, okay. And so this
Thank you.
this museum was going to be right in the middle, so you could go, it would be your trifecta of places to visit. And they really had a vision of what they wanted. And Richard ended up by leaving, and I was part of his team, so we left, but they very much, and I never went there, I don't know. They wanted a triumphalist narrative about how white abolitionists, you know, out of the goodness of their heart, helped. It was the underground, the romanticized Underground Railroad story. And we all fought tooth and nail against that with not much success at all. And then at one point, they wanted to have stage a little play, you know, a 5-minute theater experience, and it was going to be about the Underground Railroad and somebody enslaved and then getting free, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember Richard said to me, "This is when Aristotle meets Disneyland," and left.
I'll just add, in thinking about a lot of community history projects that I've worked in, I think a lot of times communities have come second, and the grants have been awarded before the communities that are supposed to be a part of these projects have even been consulted. And as Brent already said, a lot of the times that work is already happening in the community, and there's an expectation that people should be arms wide open and also willing to give in a short time span. And I think some of this is grant cycles and the way that that's set up, but also a misunderstanding of how much time needs to be invested in building trust and to really getting to understand and learn a history and to respect that these narratives are personal. And I think that's been the thing that I've noticed where well-intentioned people have been shocked when they have been received with pushback or even a sense of mistrust. And that's also not taking the time to understand your institution's relationship with communities. So for my university, that's Rutgers Newark. Rutgers Newark was built by displacing 600 families, Black and brown families. And so that relationship is very tied to that. It's not, although it's a public university, it's not seen as an open space for those who do not have business there. And so it's important to understand that ongoing relationship and the way that different institutions are invested in displacing people when you want to go to those same communities as a representative from that group, where you're not seen as different. And I've even sadly had to deal with that where, you know, I don't view myself as a person like that, but coming with the name of an institution, you have to be willing to reckon with that, be humble, and really try to work and take the time to build relationships.
Did y'all read that story about a newcomer to the U Street neighborhood in Washington, D.C., who was,
About the music?
right? And then walking their dog on Howard University's campus.
Yes, yeah, 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 yeah.
So that's a perfect example. And, you know, someone who migrated from another part of a city would then land in a historically Black neighborhood that's anchored by historically Black college and university, Howard University, a sacred landscape. And they would walk their dogs across this public institution, not understanding that that was disrespectful to that legacy and to the current students. And the students revolted, protested, and the president has restricted those newcomers or just the neighbors from accessing the campus as a public space.
So the other example was the music one. That's on U Street. So what was it? What happened again?
That was also, you know, newcomers. I mean, this actually sadly happens in a lot of places where I believe they petitioned for a noise ordinance because they thought the go-go music is too loud.
That's it. And it was there from the 1970s, and go-go is, you know, such a DC thing, and it was part of the street culture. It's part of that neighborhood. And an apartment building came along and in gentrification, and some of the people in the apartment building complained. The place, the music place, their lease was held by Apple, one of those, okay? Apple, Google, what?
Metro PCS.
Okay, all right. And they were like, okay, so you know this story. Okay, all right, you finish telling it.
Well, no, but when they had the protest, from the community, the president of Metro PCS, I think they've been taken over by T-Mobile now, but he acquiesced and said, like, back up. You know, this is a historical go-go music to the history of DC, of Black DC. So
Right.
that's what happened.
Right. So first they said, okay, no music, and then there was this incredible protest, and they backed off. Yeah, yeah.
So, unfortunately, we are reaching the end, but fortunately, this is just the beginning. And with the Black Migrations Project continuing, hopefully we have more public programs. And so I invite you all to stay tuned. I also want to thank my co-panelists so much, Carla and Brent. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, sharing your experiences. I learned a lot. I hope you all have enjoyed that. If you have more questions or comments, we would love to still hear that, and hopefully there's a space that you can direct those to. But thank you all for coming to be a part of tonight.